Some lives begin in light, and some begin with an explosion. For Serj Tankian, his earliest memory was not a song, but the moment a 7-year-old boy clutched his younger brother in a dark room in Beirut, listening to bombs fall on the city as if the sky were shattering above the roof. While other children learned to count numbers, Serj learned to count the distance between the whistle in the air and the second the ground convulsed. That fear did not simply mark his childhood. It became the invisible foundation of a voice the world would later call unlike any other. Serj was born in 1967 in Beirut, a city beautiful to the point of cruelty, where life and death could exchange places within a single afternoon. The Lebanese Civil War erupted when he was too young to grasp its meaning, yet old enough to remember every sound. There were no carefree days running under the sun, no children's songs playing in the background. His childhood was shaped by nights when entire neighborhoods sank into darkness, adults whispering plans for the next escape, and children clinging to one another, waiting for a silence so long it felt like measuring the city's heartbeat. But war was only the first layer of loss. Long before Serj was born, his family already carried an older wound, one passed down from all 4 grandparents, survivors of the Armenian Genocide. On the rare, quiet evenings, they told him about families erased, about running through the night, about people who vanished and were never found again. Those stories often stopped midway. Some details were too painful to speak, some names no one could remember anymore. That was Serj's first inheritance, a severed family tree, and an obsession with justice that had never been properly named. As the fighting intensified in the mid-1970s, the Tankian family had no choice but to leave Beirut. Serj was 7 years old. They departed on a morning heavy with the smell of gunpowder, carrying little more than a few suitcases and a fear without clear shape. Even leaving the country was incomplete. His father, born in Syria, was held back by paperwork and had to find another way to reach the United States later. The young Serj was pushed prematurely into an adult role. After only a few months of learning English, he was already reading, translating, and signing documents on behalf of his parents, contracts and legal forms he himself did not fully understand. This was not a graceful coming of age. It was survival-driven adulthood. Los Angeles was not the paradise promised in books. It was vast, loud, cold, and unforgiving to the vulnerability of a newly arrived immigrant family. Serj did not have the typical garage rock memories of many American musicians. No first guitar given for a birthday, no band rehearsing after school. He grew up in a neighborhood where everyone worked relentlessly, where every bill was calculated carefully, where the eldest son had to stand at the front to help his parents face a world they had not yet learned to navigate. Armenian Pilibos School became his only anchor, a place where Serj saw people like himself, children who shared a buried history, families torn apart by war, and the same feeling of standing between two worlds without fully belonging to either. It was there that he met Darren Malakian and Shavo Odagian, the future members of System of a Down. At the time, however, they were simply teenagers, struggling to position themselves within a country so vast it could swallow anyone who failed to hold on. After graduating from college, Serj sought stability through practical work, helping relatives in the downtown jewelry district, dealing with legal disputes that drained his family, and convincing himself that perhaps law was his path, a stable, predictable future. Yet the harder he tried to step into a life already mapped out, the more something inside him resisted. Every LSAT prep class, every suffocating lecture room filled with other people's expectations widened the gap between who he was supposed to become and who he truly was. One evening, after an especially draining prep class, Serj drove his Jeep Wrangler home. It was raining. The city blurred behind the windshield, and for the first time, he clearly heard his own voice. He pulled over to the side of the road and admitted what he had avoided for years. "I don't want to do all of this. I want to make music." That moment, brief, silent, yet so truthful it was almost disorienting, became the turning point of his life. He began making music not as an escape, but as a dialogue with the past. The years spent running and the inherited losses passed down through generations became the raw material through which Serj learned to see the world with a gaze unlike anyone else's. The shock of immigration bred empathy, and the years of carrying responsibilities far beyond his age made every vocal shift in Serj's voice seem to carry an unnamed emotional layer, at once lucid and unhinged, violent and contemplative. The world hears him sing and talks about a 4.2 octave vocal range, rated by VVN Music as one of the most diverse in metal. They mention his ranking at number 26 on Hit Parader's list of the 100 greatest heavy metal vocalists. But those accolades are only the surface. What defines Serj Tankian does not lie in technique, but in where his music is born. From a dark room in Beirut, from fragmented family lineages, from disorienting migrations, and from the moment an immigrant teenager first realized he was allowed to live truthfully. Once he understood that music was the only viable path, Serj entered a phase that was both chaotic and strangely pure. The days that followed bore no resemblance to the life of an artist destined for fame. They looked more like the early days of someone learning how to speak honestly after years of enforced silence. In the mornings, he still went to the jewelry shop, writing invoices, answering customers, resolving unfinished legal disputes. At night, he sought out small rehearsal rooms scattered across North Hollywood, places where even clumsy guitar notes were treated like gold. It was in those makeshift spaces that he began to feel something that had previously only smoldered in his chest. Music was not merely technique or aesthetics, but the only way to decode layers of memory long left untouched. The first melodies Serj wrote were not beautiful, not complete. Sometimes just lines slipping through his fingers as if he were keeping a diary in sound. But the more he played, the more he realized he was touching something he had avoided for too long. A region of memory that, if not turned into song, would harden into a wound. From rented studios like Nightingale Studios in Burbank, where wooden floors shook under every kick drum hit and the smell of old cables clung to the walls, Serj began to see music as an escape route rather than a career choice. There, in the project Soil, the embryonic version of what would later become System, he and Darren began experimenting with Waco Jesus, a song both awkward and furious, much like the stories they carried from childhood and family history. Soil was short-lived, little more than a sketch, but it left behind something none of them forgot. The sense that when they stood together, the sound that emerged did not belong to any American genre, but to a deeper realm of memory. When Soil dissolved, they drifted between rehearsal rooms scattered throughout North Hollywood. These rooms were little more than overheated boxes, torn carpets, walls soaked with old sweat, cables coiled into nests as if a single hard touch might cause the whole system to explode. Yet in those temporary spaces, Serj, Darren, and Shavo found something they could not find on any city stage: instinct. Darren played distorted riffs as if dragging the sky down toward the ground. Serj pushed his voice into directions he himself had never entered. Shavo held the rhythm as though keeping a story from shattering into fragments. When John Dolmayan joined, the looseness suddenly locked into place. His drumming did not tidy the music. It gave chaos a structure. Among the four of them, something unnamed began to form. Not a band, not ambition, but the sense that each person was completing what the others lacked, as if they were collectively writing a memory that had never before been spoken aloud. There was no declaration of formation, no definition, only late nights strung together, when everyone else had gone home and the group stayed behind in the humid room, testing whether a small musical phrase might open another door. And it was from those nights that the identity of System of a Down, still unnamed, still formless, began to stretch, breathe, find its rhythm, and then take hold of them in a way none of them had anticipated. They began bringing that unshaped sound onto stages. Whiskey, a go-go, the Key Club, the Roxy, venues where most artists simply hoped to be loud enough to rise above the chatter of beer-drinking crowds. Yet every time Serj stepped on stage, eyes sharp as if looking straight through himself, the room's energy shifted. Some were shocked. Some laughed, unsure what genre they were witnessing. Some stood frozen, unable to look away. But everyone remembered, and that was something no other LA band of that era managed to achieve. They did not belong to glam metal, not nu metal, not punk, not any recognizable form of American rock in the 1990s. The fractured rhythms tinged with Armenian colors, the political lyrics rich with imagery, the way Serj shifted his voice as if pulling the audience through layers of consciousness. All of it turned them into outsiders, monsters out of place on the Sunset Strip. And it was precisely that alien quality that brought Rick Rubin to them. That night, when Rubin, long beard, unreadable expression, stood at the back of the room, Serj had no idea he was there. He simply did what he always did, opened his mouth and let memory erupt into sound. But when the song ended, Rubin laughed. Not mockingly, but with the laughter of someone who had just encountered something impossible to categorize. After the show, Rubin approached them and said a line Darren would repeat for years. "I don't understand what the hell you guys are doing, but it really has a soul." For Serj, that moment was not about pride. It felt like a release. For the first time in his life, someone was perceptive enough to look at the sound he had carried since a childhood shaped by bombs and say that it deserved to exist. The contract signing happened so quickly it left the band disoriented. Serj later said that walking out of Columbia Records that day felt like completing a procedure far too simple compared to everything he had already endured. There were no fireworks, no celebratory embraces, just a strange lightness, as if he knew that the real journey was only just beginning. When System of a Down was officially entered into a record label's files, Serj looked around the dilapidated rehearsal room where it had all begun, and understood that his music was no longer a private dialogue with the past. It was about to step out and enter a conversation with the world. The debut album, released in 1998, felt like an unexpected door opening in front of him. He had no great expectations. He saw it merely as a transition from makeshift rehearsal spaces into a more orderly phase. But one evening, hearing Sugar play on a small radio in his old apartment changed everything. It was not just the moment a song was broadcast. It was the realization that a voice forged from years of fear, displacement, and silence was now echoing through a vast city that had never made room for outsiders. That feeling led Serj to another realization. If he wanted his voice to be truly free, he needed a space just as free. In April 2001, just before the seismic impact of Toxicity, he founded Surgical Strike Records, a small label with a simple declaration: to make room for unconventional artists that major labels routinely overlooked. Under this modest roof, names like Bad Acid Trip, Fair to Midland, Buckethead, and Visa emerged, each contributing their own form of chaos to the musical landscape Serj wanted to shape. Diverse, difficult to categorize, but honest. The Serj project with Arto Tankian also emerged from here, a fusion of Armenian folk, experimental noise, and fragments Serj could never fully fit into system. For him, Surgical Strike was not just a label, it was proof that he was always searching for ways to open doors for voices as displaced as his own. Critical response was stronger than he had expected. Kerrang! Called the band Rage, recycled into art. Metal Hammer wrote that their music breathes with the air of lands no one dares to look at directly. For Serj, such praise was both a stepping stone and a growing weight. He began to feel obligated to say the right things, to measure every lyric carefully, as if any misstep could be magnified before thousands. Long tours exhausted him, but also revealed another version of himself, more lucid, more solitary, and keenly aware that his voice was no longer meant to converse with the past, but to confront the world. When Toxicity was conceived, Serj did not set out to create a masterpiece. He simply wanted to articulate what had long been simmering beneath the surface. Abused power, people molded by fear, and the boundaries society draws to keep individuals obedient. In the studio, randomly opening a book and reading the line, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," he knew he had struck the precise rhythm the song required. Chop Suey was therefore not a track tailored to metal conventions, but a fragment of chaos, exactly the way he saw the world, full of unanswered questions. In September 2001, Toxicity debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts. The figure of 12 million copies sold would later become just a surface marker. What astonished Serj more was how the album provoked reaction. Rolling Stone wrote that it forces listeners to confront what they try to avoid. Pitchfork described his voice as a weapon belonging to no system. For the first time, Serj felt that music was not only for expression, but for interrogation. 1 week after the album's release, America was shaken. The atmosphere that had been opening for Toxicity slammed shut within hours. The nation sank into grief and fury. Any words about war, power, or manipulation, subject system had addressed for years, suddenly became dangerously sensitive. Serj's lyrics, sharp and uncompromising like an anti-war blade, were pulled into a storm he had not prepared for. In an attempt to explain, to himself and to anyone still calm enough to read, Serj wrote a short essay titled "Understanding Oil" and posted it on the band's website 2 days after the attacks. He did not justify any violence. He was pursuing a lifelong question of his own: how greed and policy generate new cycles of destruction. But in that climate of fear, a single sentence referencing superpower responsibility was enough to transform him from a celebrated artist into a symbol of treason. The post was taken down at the label's request. Some radio stations stopped playing the band's music. Call-in shows urged boycotts of system, their inbox filled with threats. In Glaring Through Oblivion, written years later, Serj recalled this as the first time in his life he censored himself out of fear of hurting his audience, and also the moment he promised he would never again let fear silence him. Overnight, he went from respected artist to target of collective outrage, simply for voicing what the country at that moment was not ready to hear in a time of extreme vulnerability. Threatening calls, canceled shows, tabloids branding him with venomous labels, all followed in rapid succession, like a storm moving against the wind. Serj did not argue. He stayed silent for several weeks, listening to the grief enveloping the nation. He understood that in moments like these, reason often pushes people further apart. But standing before a crowd at the first show after the tragedy, as the lights came up, he realized that silence could not last forever. "Music isn't meant to divide," he said slowly into the microphone. "It's meant to find the truth." The statement did not erase misunderstandings or calm America's anger, but it marked Serj's return to his core nature, not shouting to claim righteousness, but opening another door, so that those brave enough might step through and see the world with a little less fear. From that moment on, he knew he could not speak only from the stage. Shortly after September 11, 2001, he and Tom Morello founded Axis of Justice, a non-profit organization connecting music fans with social movements, anti-war efforts, labor justice, human rights. The earliest gatherings were small and fragmented, but by 2002-2003, Axis of Justice evolved into concerts, forums, and open-air classrooms, where Serj began to understand more clearly the weight of holding a microphone before an angry crowd. In 2002, the leak of demo recordings made him feel as if someone had intruded into the most private space he possessed. Steal This album was released less as a commercial strategy than as a defense of artistic intent. Around the same time, the video for Boom, created with Michael Moore, filmed in 2002 and widely circulated during the anti-Iraq war protests of early 2003, pushed Serj into a new role, a sharp-edged voice for a generation questioning war. He understood that each time he held a microphone, he was not merely singing, but placing a question in the middle of the crowd. This very maturation also brought creative tension. In 2003-2004, Serj wanted to move further toward orchestral forms, jazz, poetry, musical structures beyond metal. Darren wanted to preserve the weight of the original sound. No one tried to prove the other wrong, but each saw the band's future in a different direction. Serj chose silence, believing it would keep things stable, something he later admitted was his greatest mistake. In hindsight, he realized that it was during this period that a small, early silence thickened into an enclosed room. Everyone sensed its presence, yet no one wanted to be the first to open the door. The differences did not fracture them immediately, but they created a subtle distance between two people who had once played their first riffs together in a rundown rehearsal room in North Hollywood. Paradoxically, at the height of tension, System of a Down achieved the impossible. In 2005, they released Mesmerize and Hypnotize, two albums that both reached #1 in the same year. BYOB won a Grammy. Arenas across continents echoed with their name. Yet standing beneath the lights, Serj did not feel he was at a peak, but at the threshold of a crossroads. That was when the silence from years earlier began to stretch into something difficult to name. Not conflict, not rupture, but the sense that the most important things were being buried beneath a very thin layer of dust. So thin that everyone pretended it wasn't there. Something inside him wanted to break free from the old structure to search for a voice of his own. By late 2006, the band announced a hiatus. Outsiders assumed they simply needed time to breathe. But Serj understood better than anyone that there were things he had never spoken aloud, things which, if voiced, might collapse the very structure he had spent his youth building. So, he chose silence. And the longer that silence stretched, the more it resembled a sealed room for which only he held the key. Not a breakup, not a stop, just a pause each member needed. For Serj, that pause felt like the rainy night years earlier, when he pulled his car over and realized he had to choose music. This time, he was no longer facing old fear. He was facing his own inner voice, now clearer after years of screaming, singing, arguing, and standing in the eye of political storms. When System paused, Serj entered a strange quiet he had never anticipated. Without John's drums compressing his breath, without Darren's riffs sweeping through his chest like wind, he suddenly heard every hollow space inside himself. One night, sitting at the piano in his living room, Serj touched the keys as if checking whether his heart was still beating. The sound that emerged, softer than metal, yet heavy in the way of someone who has gone too far to turn back. Empty Walls took shape from those echoes, a song the press called a wake-up call in the age of the Iraq War. Serj was not trying to be sharp. He was simply seeing the world the way someone who had lived through 2 wars sees it. Strangely enough, when his first solo album climbed to number 4 on the Billboard charts, Serj felt not triumph, but responsibility. If his voice could stand on its own, then he no longer had any excuse to hide from larger questions. When Elect the Dead was released and reached number 4 on Billboard, Serj did not feel like he had won a contest. He felt like someone who had stepped out from behind a thick wall he once believed would forever block every private path. Without Darren's ferocity beside him, without John driving the pulse, without Chavo anchoring the lower register, yet that voice still stood alone. The realization was both weightless and terrifying. Because when there is no one left to share responsibility, every lyric becomes an oath that cannot be withdrawn. His first solo tour arrived as a trial by fire he had always believed he would avoid. Standing on stage not as the frontman of System, but as someone telling his own story, Serj felt the audience no longer watching him as a component of a metal machine, but as an individual carrying personal shadows that needed decoding. The freedom of those nights was unfamiliar, yet it echoed the feeling he once had in a rundown rehearsal room in North Hollywood, when he first realized his voice could open new territory. That freedom led Serj to Imperfect Harmonies, 2010, a musical map broader than any album he had previously made. Metal became only one element. Orchestral layers spread across it. Jazz seeped in. Electronic textures appeared like city halos at midnight. Critics labeled the album difficult, elusive, overly ambitious. But Serj was not seeking accessibility. He was searching for a language capable of holding what metal alone could not. He once said, "I want my voice to fly without hitting walls." Imperfect Harmonies became that space. No need for screams, no need for relentless riffs, just room for thoughts long compressed by war, immigration, family responsibility, finally allowed to resonate without being confined by band structure. But just as he believed he had found the stillness he needed, the world shifted again. Harakiri, 2012, emerged in a year marked by environmental and social crises spreading like fractures across nations. Serj looked at the world and saw the shadow of old memories, humanity dismantling itself in the same way cities from his childhood had collapsed before his eyes. Writing Harakiri, he said it felt like documenting the diary of a planet, cutting itself piece by piece. Between those solo albums existed yet another Serj, less visible on stage, yet working more than ever. Serj, the film composer. The music he wrote for documentaries and independent films, including The Last Inhabitant, revealed another dimension of his voice, darker, more submerged, as if he were training himself to tell stories without words. Directors often said, "Tankian doesn't bring music into film, he brings memory." By 2013, that transformation reached another peak. Serj stood before an orchestra and conducted his first symphonic work, Orca Symphony No. 1. He said he wrote Orca as a way of naming the fragments of the soul that survive through countless upheavals. The press described the premiere as an instinctive shift by an artist unwilling to be confined by any definition. That same year, he released Jazz is Christ, an album many outlets called Serj Without Borders. There was no metal, no familiar structure. It felt like a journey where each piece opened a groove of memory unrelated to any image the public had ever attached to him. Perhaps Serj had never felt more able to hear color than in the years after 2013. When he placed his first brushstroke on canvas, he realized he was releasing the same thing he released through his voice, fragments of memory that refused to stay still. Painting came to him as another exit from metallic soundscapes, not sharp, not explosive, but slowly spreading like breath. He created over 100 paintings, each paired with its own piece of music. Not as an elaborate experiment, but because for Serj, images cannot remain still without sound. At exhibitions in the US and Armenia, viewers wore headphones, stood in dark rooms, and felt as if the paintings were telling their own stories. Augmented reality technology allowed colors to leap off the canvas, but it was the music that held the viewer's heartbeat, just as Serj had always held onto the shadow of his own past across every phase of his life. During that same period, he opened yet another door: cinematic music. Serj once said film gave him permission to speak softly, something metal rarely allowed. With 1915, he wrote directly to the wound his family had carried for generations. Each note felt like placing a hand on torn memory, gentle yet piercing. The promise expanded that wound before the world. Serj's music for the film did not aim to provoke sorrow, but to preserve the humanity history so often crushes in silence. As he continued composing for Game of Thrones and Netflix documentaries, people began to understand that Serj had not changed careers. He had simply found new places where his voice could resonate without needing to shout. In the years that followed, that story was revisited through Truth to Power, the documentary that places Serj's entire journey under a single lens. How an artist can turn the weight of the stage into real political weight. The film moves through the historic free concert in Yerevan in 2015, where System played before tens of thousands of Armenians on the 100th anniversary of the genocide. For Serj, it was not merely a performance, but one of the rare moments when he felt he was singing directly atop the ground through which his family's story had once flowed. Around that same time, he received the Medal of the Prime Minister of Armenia for his contributions to genocide recognition and the development of music, an honor he regarded less as a personal accolade than as something being returned to his four grandparents. When speaking before the United Nations, Serj does not raise his voice. He speaks slowly, as if recounting family history. Human rights organizations invite him not because of his fame, but because they know that voice was forged through war, displacement, and memory passed down across 4 generations. Friends often say Serj does not play the role of an activist. He is simply continuing his family's story in a language large enough to carry it. In 2020, war erupted in Nagorno-Karabakh. The old ash of his Beirut childhood seemed to rise again. This time, Serj did not stand behind a painting, nor remain in the studio. He stepped up to the microphone as if responsibility itself were calling his name. Protect the Land and Genocidal Humanoids were written not to become hits, but to serve as signals. The band reunited for one reason alone: to say what millions of Armenians did not have the chance to say. When the fundraising campaign surpassed USD $600,000, the community understood that Serj was no longer merely an artist speaking about history. He had become someone carrying that history. The weight did not lower his voice, it sharpened it, as if he had finally found a way to keep memory from being lost in an overly noisy world. In recent years, Serj has not gone searching for a new chapter, but rather turned back to the memory currents that once resonated only in the deepest layers of his voice. As touring slowed and stage lights no longer masked every silence, he began to hear sounds long neglected. Tones that surface only when life grows quiet enough to reveal what is real. From that stillness, old pieces of music, thought to belong to a distant past, unexpectedly found their way back, as if they had been waiting for the moment he was calm enough to receive them. Elasticity took shape in that state, not as a system nostalgia piece, but as 5 fragments of emotion once caught between life's turning points. In the hands of someone who had endured too many seasons of silence, they carry a peculiar spirit. There is the ferocity of youth, but tempered by the perspective of someone who understands the value of every breath. For Serj, the album was not about remembering, but about mending the parts of himself he had left behind by moving too fast. In parallel, he wrote Down with the System, a memoir that for the first time allowed him to confront directly the darker zones he had previously only skirted. He acknowledged his own passivity during periods of creative tension, the moments when he failed to defend his artistic intuition in time, things he wished he had been stronger about. In those pages, he finally named the silence that had followed him for nearly 2 decades, the times he swallowed opinions, withdrew from dialogue simply out of fear of hurting those he regarded as family. I thought I was keeping the peace, he wrote, but in reality I was only pushing everything deeper into the dark. To admit this, even belatedly, was, for Serj, the only way to prevent an old secret from continuing to cast its shadow over future decisions. Yet through it all, his respect for Darren, Shavo, and John remains a fixed pillar, because without them, that journey would never have taken its present form. Looking back, Serj does not deny the numbers life has handed him. Nearly 40 million system records sold, a 4.2 octave vocal range, a number 26 ranking on Hit Parader's list. But what makes him pause the longest lies not in statistics, but in the truth that he has lived fully at every crossroads. Rock, jazz, symphony, painting, cinema, social activism. All of it feels like interconnected roads leading him back to the one question only deep adulthood dares to face. What remains unsaid? And do we have the courage to say the rest? It could be said that amid all the noise life has hurled at Serj Tankian, war, migration, responsibility, the conflict-laden atmosphere of music and activism, the one moment he never prepared for was meeting the woman who altered the timbre of every layer of his voice. Not in a sudden cinematic romance, but in the way someone who has lived too long in armor suddenly understands what it means to enter a room and no longer need to wear it. Serj's first portrait of love contains none of the warm colors so often found in artists' biographies. It begins with the hesitation of someone accustomed to standing before crowds, yet awkward in the face of genuine attention from a single person. When Serj met Angela Madatayan, he was already at a point where his career and social voice had turned him into a symbol in the eyes of the world. But Angela did not see a symbol. She saw a man, still carrying traces of ash from his Beirut childhood. A man who could grow so inwardly quiet, it felt as if he were listening to echoes inside his own mind. The calm in her gaze did not make him defensive. It lightened him, as if, after many years, he had finally found a place where his voice could settle without losing its strength. They came together in a way few would expect from a man whose voice sounds like thunder through stillness. Angela was born into an Armenian community in the United States where memories, much like those Serj carried, had been passed down through generations. Because of that, they shared a kind of unspoken language. When Serj spoke of watching a city collapse, she did not ask for details. When Angela spoke of the vague fears every Armenian family carries, he understood instantly. Their understanding did not grow from promises, but from the shared knowledge of what loss is, and how not to let it devour the remaining tenderness. Their wedding took place in Simi Valley, California. Quiet, far removed from the noise Serj's career had created. Those present recall that it was not the showy ceremony of a famous artist. It felt like a homecoming. Embraces, Armenian songs echoing through the space as if they were reconstructing a fragment of a homeland war had erased from memory. When Serj watched Angela walk toward him, he said the feeling was like realizing that a part of me was finally allowed to rest. Then came their son, Rumi. Serj explained that the name was not chosen for mystique or philosophy, but because he had carried Rumi's poetry through some of the darkest periods of his life. Naming his child was a reminder that amid chaos, there remains something constant: the capacity to love. Holding his son for the first time, Serj understood something years on stage had never taught him. There are moments that require no screaming, no struggle, no need to be right. Some moments require only presence. Parents often say children teach them more than they teach their children. For Serj, this was especially true. Rumi helped him understand why old wounds still unsettled him, why he kept speaking about justice, why his music always leaned toward what had not yet been said. Explaining Armenian history to his son in the language of a child taught him how to speak about pain with gentleness instead of rage. And from that point, a layer of his timbre changed, deeper, heavier, yet softened in a way he had never imagined possible. Angela rarely stands in the public eye, but her presence flows into the most important silences of Serj's life. When he composed the score for 1915, carrying the pain of an entire people into each note, it was Angela who reminded him to keep part of his heart intact. When he faced threats after political statements, she did not tell him to stay quiet. She simply said, "Say what you know is right." And when Serj pushed himself to exhaustion in his painting projects, trying to decode too many layers of memory, it was she who pulled him from his workspace and placed a warm cup of tea in his hands. Through every upheaval, their love did not take the form of a miracle. It took the form of patience. They did not build a family on the myth of the artist, but on small things: peaceful mornings, late dinners, quiet returns to Armenia, brief messages sent while he was on tour. These seemingly fragile moments stitched together a man who had grown up amid bomb blasts into someone who finally had a place to return to. If music is where Serj deciphers memory, family is where he learns how not to let memory consume the present. And perhaps that is the gentlest gift for someone whose journey began with explosions, to touch a sense of peace he once believed he did not deserve. In recent years, as tour schedules thin out and cities grow quieter, Serj has begun to live slowly in a way his younger self never imagined. Each morning, what wakes him is no longer political debates or urgent plans, but thin light falling into his workspace, a reminder that after years of running through chaos, he is finally allowed to stand still. He spends time with unfinished compositions, sketches not yet defined, afternoons sitting at the piano, and letting his hands find their own sounds. Sometimes he writes nothing at all, simply replaying old recordings and listening quietly as if hearing a distant version of himself. That silence, rather than threatening him, helps him understand that he is now standing in a chapter where the inner voice has grown louder than the noise outside. Family, once something he passed by in haste, has become a true anchor. Rumi is old enough to make him reflect on himself. Angela remains as calm as she was at the beginning, but that calm now carries more sustaining power than any applause. They do not need dazzling moments. They live through simple ones. And in that simplicity, Serj realizes what he had been missing was never the spotlight, but a place for his heart to rest. From time to time, he returns to Armenia, not as an artist representing a community, but as someone retracing the footprints of childhood. The hills, the old streets, the cold stone markers remind him that memory does not disappear. It only waits for the moment when one is calm enough to reopen it. At 55, Serj chooses fewer projects, not from a lack of energy, but from the realization that what he wants to say no longer needs to be shouted. Art is no longer a race. It is the way he gathers the parts of himself he once dropped during years that were too loud. In that quiet, he hears timbres he had long forgotten, tones that emerge only when a person finally finds their own rhythm. Serj's current life is no longer radiant or noisy. It is like a thin mist settling over the long road he has traveled. And within that stillness he understands something a lifetime amid screaming never taught him. The brightest parts of a human life sometimes exist in moments only family ever sees. Looking back, he does not see himself as a legend. He sees a Beirut child, an immigrant youth, a man carrying the memory of a people. What keeps him standing is not glory, but the awareness that every note he writes is meant to make the world a little less silent. The only question left for him now is no longer about the past, but about how his voice will resonate when there is nothing left to prove. If, in Serj's story, you recognize a quiet part of your own life, stay with us and continue these journeys together. And don't forget to like and subscribe so the next stories can find you at the right moment.